Hello, my name is Sue Lohbrach, and I've been asked to present and talk through the development of the Consultation and Information Sharing Framework that I developed in the late 1990s. Just a brief about background. I have at this point about 30 years in working in child, adolescent, and adult mental health and child protective services. So I want to thank UC Davis for the opportunity to walk through the framework here. So between about 1998 and year 2000, I spent multiple hours talking with family members, with social workers and supervisors from both the private and public child welfare sectors to try to build a framework that would hold all of the prompts for good practice moving forward, working differently at that time, and to also find a way to move through critical thinking in a more routine and everyday way. So today, this particular framework is utilized and implemented in a number of jurisdictions nationally and internationally. I'm going to just walk through a brief introduction. So some of the bits about the overarching purpose, how it's centered within a larger integrated practice model, the underlying assumptions in the development of the Consultation and Information Sharing Framework, and walk you through the framework itself. So the purpose, really, the overarching purpose of the Consultation and Information Sharing Framework is to organize information and to analyze it. One of the bits that really comes before that is the gathering of good information. So when we think about working in more effective ways with children, youth, and families, ultimately we're looking at a lot of incoming information around very complex situations in family systems. So typically what happens is that information is housed in various records electronically and in paper form, and people are having to sort of walk through basically the bits of that. So as you'll see as I sort of work through the framework, this is really a more holistic picture of the family and its journey through any particular system that they're involved with. So the information really has to be gathered comprehensively from all sources, encompass multiple perspectives and views, and to do that, it would be utilizing good engagement, effective interviewing skills, and questions. And then coming to a way to organize all of that information so that one isn't having to sort of go into the bits and pieces of a family system. Again, much more comprehensive look at that. It's utilizing more critical thinking skills. There are very significant decisions made, particularly in the child welfare system, that affect a child and a family's life really forever. So the decisions that are made set in motion a trajectory where the outcomes can either continue with children and family thriving in communities or decline in terms of their development and their working together. The categories assist in sorting the complex information, and one of the most important sort of aspects of the framework, which is encompassed in what will be called a gray area, is getting clear on what is unknown, incomplete, and speculative, and being really straightforward and honest about that. The analysis itself comes forward in the development of what I'm going to refer to as risk statements, looking at the specific concerns regarding impact on children, youth. Ultimately, if this were utilized in an adult service area, it would be the adult themselves, and what are the specific contexts that support those risks going forward. All of this informs the next steps toward clear goals. Underpinning the development of the framework are a number of assumptions that are really important situating in a larger practice model. So in the work in Minnesota, what we wanted to do was to really direct a comprehensive, balanced assessment of risk in service to the outcomes, in particular in a child welfare system, of improved child safety, well-being, and permanency. To meaningfully include the family, its extended network, community service providers, in information and perspective sharing in all phases of assessment, planning, and decision making. There's really a lot of effort in today's world around engaging family members, engaging children, and this particular model takes it steps further into actual meaningful inclusion. To organize available information that evidence information on both the risk, the harm that's been done, the concerns going forward, and putting just as much of a scrutiny and rigor around strengths, protective capacities, and factors, and to apply that knowledge through disciplined thinking in the analysis of information and decision-making going forward. To develop a shared language and understanding around goals in safeguarding children. Here, the utilization of the framework, which has been used thousands of times, tens of thousands of times actually at this point, where there are children present, youth present, elders present, has been across multiple languages, seems to be completely applicable, and so easily assimilated into conversational ways of articulating very complex information. So it brings people to a table, a common table, if you will, around being able to express themselves in a way that is jointly understood. Informing shared accountability and risk, that also is inclusive of family, whatever particular agencies and service providers involved, very inclusive of culture and community. To build capacity within the child welfare system in particular for working together constructively with family and community. To maintain the integrity of the role and autonomy of the individual social worker, part of what has happened through time is in the development of the child welfare system, which really many decades ago had been much broader around health, education, and welfare. And then in the 1960s, with the advent of the battered child syndrome, the child welfare system got fairly preoccupied with the function of child protective services. And part of what happened there is, with the subsequent mandated reporting laws, an entire system responded to the 100% of concerns around children's welfare through a very specific forensic process that was devoted to the less than 10% that were seen at that time in the emergency rooms in the publication of the battered child syndrome paper that was done by Henry Kemp and his colleagues. And alongside that, the social work practice got overtaken by the function of case management. And so for the individual social worker, what that often meant is they became brokers of finding a need within a family system and sort of assigning a service and then managing those kinds of different services and resources in the community. So what ended up happening, unintentionally, I think, through time, yet very evidently, is that the individual social worker became really the least knowledgeable about and seen as the least credible often in knowing the families that they were working with. So in this practice model, it's restoring the social work practice to the social worker and really building opportunities for greater and greater capacity. While providing the meaningful guidance, support, training, and methods of inquiry, engagement, goal development, and decision-making that go alongside some of the supervision that has also been lost along the way. There are a number of messages from research that have been brought forward. Part of my job over many years has been translating various bits of research into direct frontline practice. And so what I'm going to illustrate and show here are some of the very big points going forward. So constructive working relationships that are developed between the service recipient, so the family members, and the service provider, any of the social workers, any of the engaged or involved therapists, evaluators, other providers within the community, improve safety outcomes for children and youth. So While in many ways, working with a child protective service system or being involved with a child protective service system is a family's worst nightmare, and it's often fraught with a lot of tension, there are ways of really developing meaningful working relationships where, although there may be tension and there may be disagreements, people have a shared understanding going forward on the basis of that and the justification of that work going forward, and that's where the constructive part comes in. So this is, primarily relationships are of a very positive nature. However, the point here is even where that is filled with a lot of dissension, they can be meaningful working relationships going forward. The second bit of information from the research talks about collaboration, and here it's speaking about collaboration among professionals and other service providers. Where that happens, there's a stronger contribution to increased safety outcomes for children and youth. So just a moment ago, I talked about the case management function that is often prioritized in child welfare systems for social workers. So the tendency can be to get a number of people that are involved with family members. And without those service providers talking among themselves and alongside in particular, and most importantly the family, there's a lot of information that gets gapped. If you look at death reviews that have been done around the world in terms of child mortality and death around child protective service system or other system intervention, the findings tend to point to the absence of collaboration. So there was a bit of information that, had it been deposited at a common table, might have changed an outcome for a child. So here it's really raising up both the working constructive relationships between the social worker and the family and family members, and the collaboration among service professionals that bring them to a common table with the family. The third is around the nature of comprehensive assessment of service recipient, individual family members' strengths, needs, and protective factors alongside risk factors. Looking at a history of frequency, severity, and duration of harm. That level of comprehensiveness contributes to improved outcomes for children and youth. What has happened over time is there is so much information that comes into a service system, particularly as we're talking today about a child protective service system, that really highlights, obviously the evidence of the harm done, all of the concerns and worries going forward for children, and often that pathway continues around unpacking all of the dangerousness through a professional network of evaluations and assessments and expert opinions. What has actually been missed through time is the same amount of rigor applied to the kinds of strengths, the supports, the inherent characteristics and qualities within and assets within family members, their community, their extended family, the protective capacities, really the research-based protective factors, and to value the family and extended family and community network of information as well, without sort of canvassing more holistically in a circle process, if you will. We are without a real understanding and comprehensive look at risk. Another bit that I had looked and canvassed the research around was coming to the conclusion that there are a number of core skills that are central to the facilitation of constructive relationships and child welfare work. So if indeed what the research tells us is that working constructive relationships between service provider, social worker, and family members increases better outcomes for children and families, then how is it that we can bring those core skills that are so central to that particular relationship building style into the mix of supervision, immersion, everyday practice? One of the very, very significant aspects that the research brings to us is the meaningful involvement of family members, including children and youth, and their views in all phases of assessment planning and decision making. and the contribution that has to the development of those working relationships, shared understanding of goals, and ultimately improve safety, well-being, and stability and security, also known as permanency outcomes. So here is where I had emphasized, again, a few slides back, that a lot of work is devoted to engaging, whether that's engaging children, engaging entire family, extended family systems, engaging parents or other caregivers, engaging the caller if you're at the hotline or intake, so that you can have people fully present, for some of the subsequent interviewing or conversations that are very focused. Here it goes beyond that, into actually having people at the table, sharing information in meaningful and very straightforward ways. Without that involvement of family members, the likelihood of plans being carried out begins to diminish. The likelihood of any confidence being built going forward likely diminishes, and people get more and more confused moving alongside longer and longer into any kind of system involvement. The framework utilization is quite broad, actually. So this particular consultation and information sharing framework has this title that is without jazziness, although there have been attempts to kind of jazz it up. I tend to be a fan of, for the most part, calling things similar to their functions. I think it ends up making it a lot easier to do translations across languages and differences. And so whenever the framework is utilized internal in supervision or decision-making processes without family or other service providers present, it's a consultation framework. Where the framework is utilized with family and other present, it is an information sharing framework. So some of the utilization that I'll talk through, without a lot of detail, because there may be subsequent detailed presentations later about a number of these particular bits that I'm going to talk about. So at intake or hotline, the framework is actually embedded into what is referred to in the United States now as a RED team. RED stands for Review, Evaluate, and Direct. So it has to do with some of the front-end decision-making in particular that's done in a collaborative fashion. The RED team was also built in the jurisdiction in which I worked in 1999, fully implemented between 1999 and 2000, and has been utilized with increasing frequency in differential response systems across the US and abroad. First Nations in Canada, Métis elders have named the Healing the Spirit of Our Children's Review team. So the framework is embedded in that particular concept and forum. The framework is utilized in assessment and or investigation, depending on whether or not there's a differential response system involved. Any of the ongoing service teams across disciplines, and that is primarily linked to group supervision, which is a couple of bullets down. It can be utilized in individual supervision as well. It is the way to think through clinical casework. There are crossover forums that have been developed that use the framework as the way to collaboratively pull systems together. So for instance, practically speaking, if a child may be within a family system that is involved with the Child Protective Service system, it may be that that child meets the criteria and is also involved with a children's mental health or adolescent behavioral health system. And so one can come together to utilize the framework to develop one plan going forward. And again, it's part of an infrastructure that services collaborative practice to decrease the number of gaps where worrisome things can happen. In Minnesota, again, in particular, in southeastern Minnesota, there was a parallel justice process that was developed. And so that is basically another way to go through juvenile or dependency court At the first admit-deny hearing in Minnesota, the judge orders a family case planning conference in which the framework is embedded. There are a number of meetings that come together, different decision-making forums. One is around court access, so the framework is utilized as the method of presentation to a group who is looking at the use of the leverage of the court going forward, or if an emergency petition was generated, a review of that basis under which that petition was filed. There are multiple family meeting models in which the framework is also embedded. Present would be family, extended family, other service providers. For 10 years, I facilitated the child death and near-death reviews in the jurisdiction in which I worked in Minnesota and utilized the framework to work through that information in a multidisciplinary context. And case closure, if you will, is another place specifically where the framework has been embedded. I'm sure there are many more. It's just hard to keep track because it does seem to be received so well across, again, disciplines into adult service areas, other mental health arenas, trauma systems work. So stay tuned, and perhaps there'll be more later on another update. I'm going to now spend a little time walking you through the framework itself. As I'm talking through this, different explanations will sort of shoot in. They aren't in any particular order. I can give you just a tad for those that tend to be a little more linear and want to understand where you might go first. So ultimately I can give you a 1, 2, 3, and that's about as good as it gets, because really this framework is meant as a conversation piece to really walk through and talk through in very plain and understandable terms the very complex and plethora of information bits that are coming forward. So as I had talked about to begin with, the title is very simple. There have been attempts to rename it. I'm going to stick with this one. It seems to have been tested the longest. The first couple of bits that went up, I purposely hit a couple because I want to give you this little linear. So in the lower right-hand quadrant, if you're looking and facing the framework, is the purpose and focus of the consultation or any particular meeting. And here it is, the explanation is basically, if this is utilized within supervision, what is the social worker or the team looking for in this particular consult? What would they like the focus to be? If it's in a meeting context, then what is the purpose of the meeting? This particular heading serves to organize how much of the framework is ultimately utilized going forward and keeps a clear and crisp focus. So if this were utilized in supervision, ultimately the next steps that come out of this would be the contract, represent the contract between the supervisor and supervisee. So the clearer the purpose is, the more likely the supervisor can meet the needs of the social worker. If it's in a meeting context with family and others involved, it is just as important to ensure that the specifics of the purpose of this meeting have been outlined so that the time can be managed and the outcome can be reached going forward. So this would be the place where you would start. There are some forums in some of the review, evaluate, and direct teams that I would have talked about where the purpose actually could be quite static. So it may be at an intake or hotline level that the purpose of the particular decision-making forum is to decide whether to screen in or screen out based on the information coming in. So what that would sound like is, does the incoming information from the call at the hotline rise to the level of an accepted and valid report of child maltreatment in this jurisdiction? And if it's in a differential response context, if so, if yes, screened in, which pathway? And that would be unchanging. In supervision and in family meetings, there would be a whole host of possibilities around purpose and focus of the meeting or consultation. The second pop-up that came was the genogram/ecomap. And this is where you would go second for those that want to think through a sequencing. So the genogram, as many would recognize, is really a picture of the family system, a kind of family tree. And where the family is present, it privileges their voice as the only expert on their family system. And so they can give much more information with far fewer question marks or any gray areas. When the family is absent, it is a way to more respectfully bring them into the room and to also get very clear on who's involved in particular support systems. Are there multiple households? What are the cultural considerations in terms of connections with identity, heritage, ethnicity? The EcoMap, for purposes of this particular framework, is at least a running list of all of the other service providers involved. This goes back to the collaboration. So unless we have a bit of an evidence of who's involved, we won't be able to address bringing them together. And this goes down to the detail of, in a child protective service system, if there are 3 social workers and a supervisor who are directly involved with the family, if it's a system that has specialty areas, then it would be, social services times 3, times 2, times 5, to really get a clear picture going forward. In all of the consultations that I've done, probably about 20,000 to date, there generally is an average of 8 to 10 other service providers involved with families, and I've done consultations of upwards toward 56. And that's a lot of information that could be gapped if those folks are either unaware or disconnected from each other. Plans that families are expected to follow through on can seriously negatively impact their capacity if in fact they're going 10 different directions without a real coordination of those particular efforts. So it does take time going forward. It's critically important in the genogram to ensure that there are details put on there, and when any of the details are missing, which often, for instance, would be evidenced on the father's side, question marks must be drawn. Because one of the next steps, for instance, would likely be to talk with the people who have more information about that. The reason for referral, in the past, this has been languaged around danger and harm in some jurisdictions. I've actually settled much more clearly on reason for referral because it is used well beyond child protective service arenas. And often the heading of danger and harm had been a deterrent, that somehow it didn't apply. And so once reason for referral is the replacement, it's very easy for other multidisciplinary teams to understand its purpose. So here, for instance, in a child protective service arena, it would be a description of the detail regarding the incident or incidents bringing the family to the attention of the agency. So would read, on such and such a date, a call came in describing or reporting, and then the details of that particular call would be organized here. If it's utilized in another adult service arena, children's mental health, something like that, it may be the qualifying criteria that bring the family or the child or young person to the attention of the particular agency. Back to the child protective service arena, there would also be information gathered on any impact on the child or children, which is most often through the details of a particular injury, for instance. You can see where the engagement and interviewing of the caller for more details brings a far richer narrative of information to any decision-making table. In jurisdictions where the tendency has been to function more as a dispatch around taking the call, there has been a lot of missed opportunity to gather more information because these decision points, when utilized in the front, if you will, part of the system, set that trajectory that I talked about earlier. Every step of the way, as families move farther into the system, into ongoing service areas, or in trying to formulate a conclusion or a determination going forward, these details are really important. If they are presented as, on such and such a date, the report described, it allows for the social worker going forward to hold the possibility of multiple explanations, because here it would be the agency has received this information rather than this is the information that I hold as the truth. So going back to servicing the working constructive relationships, this is a critical bit that feeds into, can you hold multiple views? So if, for instance, the family in a screened-in referral at the point of contact with the family has another explanation, that would simply be detailed here as well. That it is discrepant may be a complicating factor. So the other further definition around reason for referral talks about pattern and history, in particular of past allegations or information about child abuse and neglect. We know that past history of abuse and neglect and its unpacked understanding of what that is still a predictor of future likelihood, so we are very clear on wanting to capture that information going forward. And in the framework, it may actually be captured in sort of bits of bullets. So between 2011 and 2013, there were 3 reports and a bit about the description and the disposition of that. Because that level of detail can be gotten through electronic or paper records, it's more important on this framework to get a sense of what that looks like, how far back does it go, how recent has it been, rather than all of the specific details that may be for further on conversations. Here is a prompt, strengths and protective factors, another prompt for practice. At the time that I was building this framework, there was a lot of sort of skepticism, if you will, around strengths-based perspective, criticisms that you're just reframing kind of the glass, if you will, from half empty to half full, or you're trying to get a list of strengths to somehow outweigh the worries. And so I needed to really describe more thoroughly what is meant here. So by strengths, and strengths is a kind of a jargon term today, I think, so we have to understand what's underneath that and what does that mean. So the prompt is around the assets, the resources, the capacities within the family, any individual and community. So this might have to do with the supports that they have available, meaning, people or activities that are there to help support them going forward, that help out getting that kind of information on the table. When I was building this in Minnesota, there was a lot of work done in the jurisdiction that I worked with around research-based protective factors. So I made a space here for that, the presence of research-based protective factors. So just as a quick example, it may be a strength that the family describes other family members that are around, and that may be support. When they start to talk about family members where there may be a couple of adults, an aunt or an uncle, who have really positive and good relationships with the children, they're by all accounts competent adults and they're in for the long haul, that would be a protective factor. So enduring relationship with another competent adult is a research-based protective factor for children. So you can see, if you kind of think about a bit of a triangle, the base is the strengths, the support that's available. Within that support, if there are other competent adults that are in for the long haul in terms of relationships with the children, that may well be a protective factor. And when I get to the notion of safety and belonging, strengths demonstrated as protection and connection over time. So let's say that aunt or uncle steps in, takes good care of the children when times are stressful in the family. That might actually hit that definition. So you can see how that needs to be really specified going forward and has different meanings as you move forward. I would like to say today that there is a more ready understanding and vocabulary around protective capacities. I think, at least in the experiences that I've had, that is still a missing piece. And I suspect it is still serviced by the thinking, if you talk about things going well with the family, even interviewing the caller at a hotline level or intake level, that somehow they will be concerned that that will override and lessen their concern in the eyes or the ears of the person that they're talking to. So there's still much more work that needs to be done around that. Complicating factors really was a place to build sort of being able to separate the conditions or behaviors that contribute to greater difficulty or complexity for the family. It could actually be for the social worker or the agency. That may have some contribution down the road to the development of risk. At the moment, as we're organizing information, though, appears to contribute more toward just makes things tougher. So I gave an example a few minutes ago about the information that may be discrepant. So if the family has another explanation or understanding for the reason for referral or for the injury, the hospital, let's say, has reported something else. We're locating both explanations under reason for referral. However, that they're discrepant is a complicating factor for the agency because the agency must manage that level of cognitive dissonance, if you will, moving forward. And so again, from a family standpoint, in terms of engagement and building working relationships and actually getting much more meaningful information, those explanations and their discrepancy are really critical going forward. So we want to, in a critical thinking mode, avoid landing judgmentally for or again until we can really develop the evidence and the planning that actually might be much more comprehensive than the agency had initially thought. So the family's information is actually critical. And yes, it makes it more difficult going forward where there is, beyond disagreement, actual discrepancy. Again, I needed a place in the building of this framework to locate the presence of research-based risk factors. And so this is also the place for that. Those risk factors may not have risen up to a clear contribution to the concern going forward. However, they are part of the information as one is thinking about the work going forward. So the gray area, which doesn't pop up on its own, is really a place for incomplete or speculative information. In many consultations, meaning supervision sessions, meetings with a family absent, much of the time is taken up by speculation about what something might mean. Here we're trying to cut that completely and saying, you know, if we really don't know, then let's be clear about what we don't know and put it in the gray area for now, and it will likely be a next step going forward. So far what we have in the front end of a system where the framework is being utilized, you may have just a bit of a sketch of information coming in under reason for referral, maybe a tiny bit of a picture of the family system, and a whole lot of gray area. Should the family remain in relationship to the agency, compelled to go further into the system, are involved, their extended family, their community, and other service providers are in the mix, you can see that many more perspective and views are brought into service here. I will just say that it is far less likely that there will be very much of a gray area when you have family members present. The gray area can get really big if you proceed in working without the family present. And yet what happens is, without a gray area to prompt us that we really are unsure and there's information that's unknown, we tend to fill in the blanks. So we want to really avoid that to maintain the most important parts of critical thinking. I'm just going to go forward to fill in the others and then step back a moment and walk through any particular details that I also want to put into this description for you. So the risk statements are really the analysis of all of the information that has come into the mix. This framework holds absolutely everything. So if there are specific risk and safety assessments, tools that you utilize, they can either be conversationally discussed in terms of the items that have been endorsed. There may be conclusions. So where you utilize formal risk assessment, for example, you may have a conclusion that there's a high risk of likelihood of reoccurrence going forward, and so that information may be organized in the framework as well. Any kinds of diagnostics around mental health diagnoses, physical health diagnoses, any other formal diagnoses can be held here. I have found a place for everything, so it is comprehensive in that context. So in keeping with the description of this use in Child Protective Services, child welfare matters, the analysis is in the risk statements. So here, what we want to really get clear on is, what is the agency concerned about happening to the child or children? Are they concerned about physical injury, death, failure to thrive, sexual harm, social emotional harm, academic decline? Those kinds of impacts. And when are they most worried that would happen, which becomes the context. So when the parents may be using specifically methamphetamine and their attention and supervision is limited or impaired, someone forgetting to feed the baby without supervision specific to the child's needs or complex needs. Should a parent become so frustrated, put the hands on for punishment or shake? You can see how it starts to get more and more specific. So what is the worry going forward for the child or children? What is it that you are concerned will be the impact? And what are the behaviors or the environment that is most concerning around a level of dangerousness or hazardous aspects? Most child protective service systems can easily develop the context. The parents are using methamphetamine. What's harder is, when the parents are using methamphetamine, what is it that you're worried about happening to this child or these children? And that gets more and more difficult for people to articulate, particularly when you get into some of the areas of, a young person who by all counts is doing well in all life domains. That's harder to think about that particular risk, if you will, impact on the child or children. There may ultimately be one risk statement. There could be as many as 10 or 15, depending on the complexity of the family system. I'll show you a little bit later a version of a template in terms of the risk statement to put it into a simple form. The category of safety and belonging is tied to the definitions that are tied to references. So here, the definition would be strengths demonstrated as protection and/or connection over time, and a pattern and history of exceptions. So here is where I gave the example of family members may have other family members who help out, geographically available. Within that helping out system, they've got a couple of adults who are competent, who take good care of the children for the long haul, and they have stepped in over the last 6 months, 3 years, whatever the time frame is, and have taken good care of the children when times have been stressful. Originally, this particular framework centered around safety, and that can be personal safety as well as environmental and caregiving aspects. So it is safety in its affirmative sense. Any threats to safety are actually embedded into risk statements, reason for referral, and complicating factors. So here it's thinking differently about the construct of safety. And because of all of the work that has been done in child welfare systems around stability and security of care, also known as permanency, and the prevention of children languishing in care, and the poor outcomes for children who age out of care, I have added the prompt of belonging to understand that children have a right to their identity, their connections, their family, for people who are meaningfully involved in their lives, who they can turn to, feel connected to, community connections, and that must be raised up alongside. What I was discovering is that without a prompt in terms of practice, meaning an actual kind of word that triggers the research behind it, that gets sort of set off to the side. Pattern and history of exceptions really comes from thinking through a solution-focused lens. And I'll just give an example in a child protective service context. So it may be that 13-year-old, 14-year-old has presented under a reason for referral with the evidence of welts on his or her back. The information has come forward that has been in the context of punishment with some sort of strap or cord. So the questions going forward, for example, in interviewing or conversations with the family would have to do with, when was a time that you wanted to hit Kate and you did something different that was helpful instead of hurtful? And what else, and what else, and what else? So the query for exceptions and the amplification for detail. Because this really services the interventions that are chosen. So if the family is automatically sort of assumed to have a parenting gap and they're sent to parent education, when they're talking about what's happening for them, it has to do with more self-regulation, which parenting education would poorly, if address at all. So here, if the family, however, has a history of spanking and restraints and soap in the mouth and pepper and other aversion tactics of punishment, that does talk about sort of a difference in understanding what's available to them, and that rather than discipline, there's a use of punishment, hands-on, and the introduction of hurtful substances. If, in fact, they also have a pattern in history, though, of timeouts, time-ins, revocation of privileges, that may be a very different intervention going forward. So the way that this framework ultimately guides practice is that you would want to be very, very clear on the strengths and protective factors that are available, have a lot of rigor with examination of that, because that provides the raw material, if you will, toward building good and sustainable, meaningful, practical plans. Have a sense of the complicating factors to know if any of those factors contribute to the risk statements. And ultimately, every context of risk must have the strengths demonstrated as protection and or connection as applied over time wrapped into them. So the final is the development of next steps, which are sort of the tasks building toward the goals of planning. And the next steps and all of the service planning and case planning would be tied to the context of risk. So if the concern is that the children will be physically hurt again in the crossfire of dad throwing things about the house and hitting their mother, and all of the next steps are servicing education and support to the mother and children, we have missed the context, which is his behavior in the home. So the next steps here, in that example, for instance, would be heroic measures around engaging a father who may be reluctant or skilled at staying away from engaged relationships, to be able to build safety to that particular context of risk. So that's ultimately a look at the framework. In subsequent slides, I'm just going to unpack a little further about some of them. This framework is utilized on whiteboards, flip charts, laminated paper, just bits of paper, kitchen table, on the floor. What it provides is a collective task. So when you have family members, service providers, people all together in particular, or if you're in a supervision setting with peers and supervisors present, it's developing a holistic picture of either the work being done or the family in its more totality. And so what people are very interested in doing would be making sure that the information is coming from the table to the board. It takes away storytelling and venting and supervision as really useless ways of practicing thinking and talking about families or managing social worker frustration and anxiety, and gets to a much more disciplined thinking about the work going forward. When family members are in the room, it's less about who's right and who's wrong, and more about getting it up there. I mean, it may be a complicating factor that this particular family member has a history with social workers with zero confidence. I mean, I'm on video, so I won't use some of the stronger language that people may use. However, I think you all have an understanding of what I would be saying. It's not about challenging or getting engaged in an almost combative, adversarial conversation. It's like, let's get it up there, let's get it right. Let's get judgments attached to the people who are forwarding them. So it really has a process function as well as an organizing and analytical function going forward. The scale on here, because sometimes it's confusing for folks, is really intended as a prompt around a continuous progress toward closing scale. So this really represents a closing scale, scaling taken from the solution-focused work. This one would most often be framed as on a scale of 1 to 10, where 1 is you're completely concerned the same or worse will happen to the child or children. 10 is enough safety for Child Protective Services to close. Where are people at on the scale? Ultimately, when there's safety and belonging built to each context of risk, and everyone involved with the family, including all family members who are able, scale at a 10, then that signals closure. There are those moments where there are some service providers who are concerned about staking a claim for closure and will say, 9 is about as high as I get. Then the closing scale is 1 to 9. I mean, this is in the context in which I'm presenting the framework today, is in the example of Child Protective Services, and so there must be a stake for enough safety for Child Protective Services to close. One of the things that has happened over time is that often it's easy to get sort of intrigued and preoccupied with the complicating factors. And the point here is it's all about the risk statements. The complicating factors in any contribution have been taken into account. However, at the end of the day, there may be many things in the complicating factors that could be present even in all families that would not justify a continued Child Protective Service involvement over time. So it's very clear around drawing a line through what this intervention is meant to really provide. And then at the very bottom, there's a bit of a sentence about recognizing the family's position around any next steps. You know, how willing are you on a scale of 1 to 10, you know, where 1 is no way, 10 is good to go forward with the bits that were agreed to here? How confident are you that if you step forward with any of these, it'll make a difference? And what, if any, barriers might be present around progressing in any of those areas? So if a family's got to go 10 different directions and they're without a car or gas money or other transportation, that's a likely barrier with diminished capacity for them. That's a complicating factor probably for both agency and family. So it gives some idea of kind of the living work of this. So from a linear standpoint, you start with the purpose and focus, you go directly to the genogram, reason for referral. From then on, it is a conversation. Sometimes I'm asked the question of, you know, what went into the mix of this particular design, and does it make sense, you know, to do any kind of what I'll call add-ons? There actually is reasoning behind this design. The purpose and focus of the consultation is in a lower quadrant because it grounds the entire meeting or consultation in its focus. It's on facing the framework on the right-hand side because, one, I have a lateral preference toward right-handedness, and the other is there's more room on that side. The centerpiece is about the family in the genogram, getting clear on what we don't know in the gray area, and what are we going to do next. All of the safety, belonging, strengths, protective factors fold in to inform that, as does the reason for referral, risk statement, and complicating factors. So any add-on changes the centerpiece, and most of the add-ons that I've seen are really about compliance bits that if practitioners understand how to recognize those bits in the framework information, they are all there. Child vulnerability, if you've got the genogram, if you've got the ages, if you have any information about complex or special needs of children, it's all in the mix. Cultural considerations are part of the genogram. It is part of the living narrative of that particular family. So at this point, I have yet to see an add-on that is a particular enhancement. The other, as long as I have the picture up, that's important to think through is we tend to be really oriented toward compliance from supervision, well, from above supervision to working with families. In no way is this framework a tool, and in no way is its primary focus to fill in the blanks. There is as much information gleaned from what's absent as from what's present. So it is critically important, in my view, to be really honest and clear about the information, and to be really honest and clear about the gaps in information, to avoid really missing something by getting into a compliance base. The other sort of observation through all of the years that I've been working in this arena would have to do with where there's a struggle around closure, it's a tendency to have measured compliance. So in a case management kind of system where there's a decision about a need and a service to sort of put in, and then it's about monitoring the family's, cooperation and attendance and all of those bits. At the end of the day, that compliance may have nothing to do with what I'm demonstrating in terms of a risk statement or multiple risk statements within the family. So this clearly steps outside of that compliance base and gets at more of the root of what the concerns are going forward and the remedies that can be brought into service to move that forward. So here are some additional prompts around the genogram. It is important to have as expansive a genogram as possible. So working with the family around who's in the family system, rather than who's important to your family. Many families, including probably our own, would tend to leave off people that you have some conflict with or that you feel marginalized from. So we get less of a picture when we limit our questions. So who's in the family? Where there is reluctance for family members to talk about family, it may have to do with concerns about the agency contacting people without the family knowing, so that would be something important to talk about so that the family is assured. There may be reluctance in terms of concerns around immigration status and disclosure, so there are conversations to be had around sort of working through that. At the end of the day, you want as expansive of a membership as possible, including extended family, cultural communities that people are a part of by identity or other connection. Fictive kin. I'm a strong proponent of pets on a genogram for a number of reasons. One, pets are very important to people, and we may misinterpret a child's reluctance to go from household 1 to household 2 as something about the adults or other children, when it may simply be reluctance to leave the dog or the cat or whomever. Second, pets afford an opportunity to have more difficult conversations at times with children, young people, and adults. It may be easier to talk about what the goldfish might have seen or might have experienced than sometimes personalizing that to self. There have to be strong intentional efforts around introducing pets and children in particular. So when we think about separating children from their families, whether it goes to other family members, for example, or stranger or non-kin foster care, pets in that home can prove as a threat if not introduced properly. So I remember one situation in which about an 11-year-old tended to take on as one of his behaviors provoking dogs in the neighborhood to see if he could get them to chase him and get away before they would attempt to bite him. So when this child was moved into a home, what people had off of their radar was that there were 2 very large dogs in that household that could prove, if provoked, to have a lethal outcome. So to be thinking in all realms with regard to that. It is important to put ages of family members. Social work does involve math. And so when you get a birth date, it's like have somebody do the math in terms of ages. It does make a difference to have an understanding of ages at the time that parents might have been when children were born, ages today, looking at kinship care arrangements, who's all in the home. That is important, at least first names and getting it right by culture. So that you're not dealing with, one that I remember is that, if there's a pronunciation in a particular culture, you want to get that spelling and pronunciation right rather than put it in the context of an American kind of equivalent, for instance. So it's all providing information regarding social environments, drawing circles or dotted lines around households so that you have a sense of are children going in or out of different households. Who do we know to be living in any particular household? The eco-map is really that information regarding service provision and clear concerns around fragmentation of service provision. So at least that running list alongside the genogram. The reason for referral, we talk through specific and detailed regarding allegations, descriptions, qualifying criteria, any prior history. Complicating factors, here you can look at distressed environments, threatening environments, behaviors that are troubling, emotional states prolonged and are exaggerated in particular going into some of the work around special attention to trauma. Here would be a way to practically think through. I think one of the other practice pieces that I wanted to put in is to avoid sweeping generalizations. So this often happens more in the supervision setting, where a social worker will say, or somebody will say, the parent has mental health issues. And so then the question is, when you say mental health issues, what does that mean? And you get the behavioral and observational description. If there's a formal diagnosis, that's also noted. Much of the time, it's an informal judgment that is sort of made in a careless and unintentional way, and yet can carry a lot of weight going forward. So if we think about, some of the social justice threads that go through the work that we're all involved in, it's important to be really clear and to stay within our competencies around that kind of work. The strengths and protective factors, and to recognize that strengths in and of themselves are, a bit of a jargonized term. So to ask the question of, are there any strengths in the family? Both gets you a low yield of information in terms of a yes-no question, and also there has to be knowledge about unpacking, who do the family members turn to when things are tough? What other options have they had in the past around living arrangements, sort of timeout plans? What resources do they have available in terms of money and food, daycare, those sorts of things. Here you can also look at the stability of the environment, self-regulation, self-protective kinds of capacities. I've just given a bit of the examples here. There's so much warehoused behind the framework. That would be for another time or guidebook, if you will. The gray area is very, very critical. One example that I wanted to give in terms of some of the trauma-based work is it may be a complicating factor that somebody says that a young person has been suspended from school. So you could write suspended from school, or you could ask the question about what do we know about the suspension. So it may be a gray area and a next step to follow up on that we know nothing about it, or it could be a description of they were fighting. So you could add that to a complicating factor, or you could ask the next question, what do we know about the fighting? So if what we know about the fighting is that this young person walked into the cafeteria, was confronted with another young person, the first young person leaps onto the other and starts hitting and hitting and hitting and has to be pulled off and describes not remembering, there you may have an indication of emotional and behavioral dysregulation that could signify trauma. The details drive the interventions. So one may be completely unattended to around, oh, there he or she goes again, suspension for fighting, or maybe a more standardized approach about working on anger, or maybe an indication of a stronger need around regulation and help with getting to a calming state. So it is in the details that the interventions are more specifically and more effectively applied. Diagnoses, so the question would be, to the sort of generalized statement of the parent has mental health issues, has there been a formal diagnosis? If so, what is that? And where you can to unpack that into behavioral terms, even if there is a formal diagnosis. An example might be a child has a diagnosis of reactive attachment disorder, and although there's many, qualifying criteria and many ways of describing that, one of the simplest frames may be that he or she is wary of adults, and that means something in terms of how you might approach that child around engagement or work within the family system. Medications. So where there is a formal diagnosis, the next logical question is, what if any medications are prescribed? And here it would be knowledge about side effects, drug interactions, helpful in terms of the regulation or taken as prescribed or not, information to pass into other caregiving arrangements, checking in with the parent and the child, whoever is prescribed, could be both the adult or the child or young person. Where you're utilizing formal risk and safety assessments, here I'm languaging structured decision-making. This was the formal risk and safety assessment utilized in the jurisdiction in which I built the framework. So here you have the conclusions around risk level and the conclusions around safe, unsafe, safe with a plan, or conditional. And then there are the whole aspects of becoming conversational with the items within the risk assessment, which is a version of understanding research-based risk and protective factors, or in this case, actuarial-based. Safety and belonging, a bit more unpacking here. So the strengths demonstrated as protection and connection over time, evidence of self-regulation, emotion, behavior, supportive environment that has contributed to calm states, thriving and progressing in terms of young people or self, safety plans, support plans utilized in service to the protection of children, youth, adults over time, structured decision-making, risk reassessment, or other risk reassessments that you may have. In the definition of strengths demonstrated as protection and connection over time, think of over time as at least longer than the last longest time, to give some sort of baseline going forward. This is just a little graphic. Often in the risk statement development, particularly where there are concerns around care of children, supervision of children, looking after them sorts of things, there would need to be sort of a baseline. So you're looking at supervision or care specific to that child's needs, and needs would be unpacked as basic needs, developmental needs, and complex needs. So a 12-year-old's need for supervision with a diagnosis and the behaviors that accompany that under some sort of autism or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or any particular physical challenge may be different than a child who meets the developmental milestones that would be typical of his or her age. The next steps become the building blocks to the achievement of the goals going forward to come to a conclusion of the intervention. So in a child protective service system, the broader goals are child safety, well-being, and permanency or stability and security of care. And so the risk statements would reflect the barriers or threats, if you will, to achieving those kinds of goals, and the next steps and the planning in between and the intervention strategies, choices, and resourcing are the way to get there. So here, the next steps would outline, the detail about what needs to happen specific to the either clarifying areas in the gray or the context of the risk going forward. So the what, the who needs to be included, and the timeline. If left as just sort of bullets without people and time responsibilities attached, they tend to languish. So here, be very specific. Generally speaking, if you want kind of a bit of a guideline, next steps in any one meeting or any one supervision session should probably stick to 3 to 5. To get a long list is probably inviting incomplete progress. So in a supervision setting, because the next steps represent the contract between supervisor and supervisee, the work going forward at the next check-in would be, which items were they able to progress on and what got in the way to anything moving forward. In a meeting forum, the next steps represent the agreement among the participants in that meeting. And so again, the question at a follow-up would be, which next steps were progressed and what got in the way of any of the others being progressed. So next steps are very much a part of follow-through in both meetings and supervision sessions. I wanted to demonstrate the risk statement, a bit of a template. So the risk statement in a child protective service context is, what are you worried or concerned will happen to the child or youth if nothing changes? So the what represents the risk. And when are you most worried that would happen? So the way that this sets forward is the child or youth's name is always first. So if the risk statement applies to more than one child in the home, this could be, Katie, Jared, and Joey. If it applies to specifically one child, it may be Katie. So Katie, and then maybe, because it is our best analysis given all the information at hand. We are without crystal balls of certainty. However, we owe it to the family to be as clear and responsible as possible going forward. So Katie may be, and then physically hurt, sexually hurt again, fail to thrive, die, be emotionally and socially hurt, decline academically. When or should blank happen? So, should mom, dad, and the babysitter become so frustrated they shake, or when the parents are using cocaine and their attention and judgment is impaired without supervision and care specific to her special needs or complex needs. So that's sort of the example there. Ultimately, if you want to think about an endpoint statement, the safety and belonging statements, the goal representation would be the risk of physical injury to Katie when dad or mom gets so frustrated and shakes her, is being or has been addressed by, and then you detail the planning that has been done or the demonstration that has been evidenced through time that has been built to that particular context. So again, just like you may have 5 risk statements, you may in the end have 5 progress and or closing kinds of goal statements moving forward. So how does this all come together in terms of an overall practice context? There is gathering information in the context of an engaged relationship at all phases of a service system. So that may be at the hotline or intake, it may be at the point of decision making, the conclusion of investigation or assessment in the ongoing service areas. And I think even going a step beyond the notion of an engaged relationship is primarily we're talking about an engaged involuntary relationship. So engagement in voluntary relationships has some differences than engagement in an involuntary relationship where there's an imbalance of authority. So in order to manage that, we have to use our authority more strategically and responsibly. So one way in a practice context to manage that is, at least what we did in the jurisdiction that I worked in, was to take out references to uncooperative and resistant families and to think instead about engaging someone who's reluctant, afraid, or in some sort of protest. It more meaningfully puts the responsibility sort of on the social worker to think more creatively and engage supervision and peers in more creative ways to work through that, and to be very straightforward. What people without authority generally want to know from people with authority is what those people are thinking. And if we go back to the very beginning of the utilization of the framework, this is around more disciplined ways of thinking through the work. Bad habits get developed when venting and storytelling about families is a way to manage frustration and anxiety. Those bad habits are ill-transferred into family meetings. So the clearer you can be about language, the more straightforward, the more likelihood of engaging with people who have been afraid or who are protesting the relationship going forward. So in order to gather good information in that context, you have to think through a way to approach families differently, and the framework can provide a way of prompting through a more comprehensive assessment. The organizing the information is where the framework really comes into play in a very visible way. The analysis and the development of the risk statements. The seeking solutions is in the development of plans where the next steps build toward that. And the securing safety, stability, and belonging are the overarching goals in a child protective service system. Working in another service system around adult services, public health, adult kinds of corrections, restorative justice practices, very similar. Maybe some language changes around the way the goals are articulated and outcomes and requirements. The Consultation and Information Sharing Framework has multiple references when I built it. That's where the actual frame and the headings and the language and the explanations are directly tied to. So there was a lot of work done around research-based risk and protective factors because structured decision-making was front and center in that system as the formal risk and safety assessment that was brought forward. The solution-focused way of thinking through building skills in good casework practice, the thinking through the definitions coming from a couple of different risk assessments more globally, the work around family group conferencing and what we know about the inclusion and meaningful participation in all phases of the work with families, the messages from research, the notion of eco-maps, the developing of infrastructure that sets the tone for collaborative practice, taking it out of the individual realm, the genogram development, the continued work around the strengths perspective and bringing that alive, work that was done around signs of safety and really thinking through the ways of building constructive working relationships with families and the principles on which to base that work going forward. And there have been so many people in both the private and public sector in southeastern Minnesota that were so critical in sort of moving this forward. So thank you.